Thank you very much, Hassan. I will just get started with my slides here. So thank you all for coming this evening or afternoon or morning, wherever you're coming from. I'm going to talk for about an hour, I think, about the ethics of space settlement, and then I really look forward to chatting with all of you for our Q&A session afterwards. So if you'll indulge me, I'm just going to start off by talking about myself for a few slides, because a lot of people ask me how to get into space ethics. It's both an old and a new field, and as a new field, a lot of people are coming into space ethics from a lot of different directions, different backgrounds. There are people who are philosophers and ethicists, of course, but also people who are working in the space industry, people who have backgrounds in the humanities and social sciences. And so it's a really fascinating subject right now to get into. So I'm just going to explain my path, going from being an astronomer to a space ethicist, someone who works in space ethics. So I got a PhD in physics from a university in Baltimore, the University of Baltimore County, and that was in 2015 or so. I got to wear the fancy hat, and my research was in computational astrophysics. I write computer programs to model asteroid belts around other stars to try to find exoplanets. And I did that for a few years. Nowadays, I actually, for my day job, I work outside of academia. I work for a video game company that makes a game called Universe Sandbox, which is the same kind of gravity simulation that I was working on before, but now you can buy it on your home computer. It's very interactive. It's got beautiful graphics, and it's very educational to get a sense of the scale of the universe and of space. It's a lot of fun. But along the way, during that process, when I was working as a postdoc doing academic research, I had a great opportunity to go out to Silicon Valley in California as part of the first year of a program called the NASA Frontier Development Lab. They were working on using machine learning to focus on planetary defense, to protecting us all from comet collisions. But along the way, they really made a point to introduce us to a lot of people in the new space industry. So this is this rapidly growing private commercial space business that we've been hearing a lot about in the news. So this includes places like SpaceX and Blue Origin, people who want to send people to live on Mars and make orbital hotels, but also the people who are really interested in space mining asteroids, mining the moon, and mining Mars. So we got to meet a lot of these people, which I was very excited about because I'm interested in humanity's future in space. But I realized as I was asking these entrepreneurs questions about various challenges that I think we'll probably face as we try to move our human activities into space, I would ask them about things like, how are you going to protect labor rights if you're sending people out to work in a space mining site, for example? What are we going to do about environmental protection to make sure we're not using the resources too fast, to make sure we're not contaminating the space environment? And as I asked these questions, the answers I tended to get from people in the new space business were, oh, well, that's a fair question, but we'll worry about that later, which didn't seem right to me. That seemed like the sort of thing you need to work out ahead of time. But I also recognized that I didn't have the background and the expertise to be able to answer these questions either. Just like the people I was talking to, most of them in the new space business, they either have a background in finance and business or in space and technology like I do. We're not really trained to think about these kinds of questions. So when I got back from that research program, I did what any good millennial will do when they have a question. I made a podcast called Making New Worlds, which is still available online for free. I will say that making a podcast is a really great way to start exploring a new idea, a new subject area. There's a really low barrier for entry. You don't need to spend a lot of money to start doing it. You can share the product you produce with other people. And it's actually a really great way to trick people into having conversations with you. So if you reach out to these really cool experts and professors and experts in various subjects, if you say, oh, this is for a podcast, they're much more likely to answer your emails. So that's a tip for you. So Making New Worlds is about the ethical and human rights issues that I could come up with that I think that we'll encounter as we try to build human settlements in space. And in particular, I interviewed people like philosophers, historians, sociologists, activists in various subjects, but also medical doctors, engineers, technical people as well. And that was a great experience. And then I was approached not long after that about the idea of turning the podcast into a book. And that's where my book came from that Hassan mentioned at the start of the talk. It's Off Earth: Ethical Questions and Quandaries for living in outer space. So it's mostly an expansion of the podcast. I took the opportunity to do more interviews with other experts. I updated my research. I threw in the latest space news because this is a very fast-moving industry right now. And it asks a lot of questions, some of which I won't be able to cover in this talk, about things like, should we be doing this in the first place? Let's explore the arguments for and against settling space. Let's ask, why do we want to settle space? Everyone you ask has a slightly different answer to that. And the reasons that we have for why we want to be going about this business are really going to affect the decisions that we make. And most importantly to me, if we're going to settle space, then how should we do it? Are there decisions and planning we can do ahead of time to make sure that we're avoiding repeating the mistakes of human history? I'm sure we'll come up with new mistakes to make. We're good at that. But at the very least, we can learn from our past to try to make a better future in space. So my goal these days is really to try to get other space people, space industry, technology and space scientist people, to think about these social and ethical problems of space settlement, not just the financial and technical ones. So along the way, while I was writing the book, I was invited to another great opportunity, which is that I co-edited a book called Reclaiming Space, Progressive and Multicultural Visions of Space Exploration. That was with an actual philosophy professor, Jamie Johnson Schwartz. She's been working on space ethics for a while, and Linda Billings, who's been a consultant for NASA for most of her career. So this book tries to amplify the kind of voices you don't usually hear in public conversations about space exploration and space settlement. It's got 27 chapters, and despite that, it still doesn't include all the perspectives that we wanted to include. So that work is certainly not done. I also had the opportunity to co-found a nonprofit organization called the Just Space Alliance, with a mission to advocate for a more inclusive and ethical future in space, and to harness people's excitement for space to get them to figure out how to build a more just and equitable world here on Earth today, instead of waiting until we settle space to figure out how to do things better. And I co-founded that with another astronomer, Lucian Wakowicz, who had been thinking about a lot of these same topics. So that's enough about me. Let's get to the main question, which is, why do we need to even worry about ethics in space? Shouldn't we be focused more on worrying about, breathing in space and how to build the rockets? Well, people like to talk about space as a blank slate where we can build these future utopias. You see all these beautiful concept art for the colonies we're going to build in space. And indeed, right now, space does look pretty blank, right? The only robots are living on other planets right now. There's no humans up there. And then things look like a blank slate where we can have a lot of imagination for what we could build there. But space is only going to be a blank slate until humans get there. And then we're going to be bringing all of our human problems with us, our prejudices, our biases, our vices. So we need to think now about what structures we can build, what plans we can make to make sure that we're not stumbling into repeating those mistakes of history, and making sure that as we write on this blank slate, we're not just making things worse in space. So I'm going to talk about some examples from my book. Unfortunately, I can't cover all of them. And I'm going to break it into three big chunks. And these mostly feel like questions. Sometimes I feel like my book is just filled with questions. But the questions get you started thinking about the problems that we might run into, and start sparking ideas for possible solutions. So the first question I want to bring up is, how are we going to live with the space environment? In particular, how should we share and protect the space environment? It's actually kind of hard to get people to think of space as an environment worthy of protection, because it looks like this. Sometimes I get tired of just showing landscapes from Mars and the moon. So this is actually Venus on the left and Titan, a moon of Saturn, on the right. So this doesn't look like the environment that we usually see in posters asking us to recycle and protect the environment, right? There's no rainforests, there's no pandas or coral reefs, but there's a lot of aspects of the space environment that make it important that we think about how to protect it and how to share it. So for one thing, it was here before we got here, right? These environments are pristine. They've never been touched by humans. They're older than the human race. And so we need to ask whether it's worth protecting just for its own sake and preserving that cosmic history. But it's also full of really valuable and useful resources that humans want to use, especially if humans want to go to space to live there. We don't want to have to bring all of our resources with us. And we also, if we're going to do this in a capitalist way and have a business case for going to space, we need something there that we can extract to recoup our costs from going up there. Space as an environment is also really scientifically rich. So in that way, it's kind of like Antarctica. Scientists really want to get there and study this fascinating environment. They'll put a lot of work and expense into doing that. And in particular, scientists don't especially want to have to share this environment with a mining company that doesn't care about the science and is trying to dig up the land that they're trying to study. So that can lead to conflict too. And the most important point about space that we need to keep in mind as we think about it as an environment is that we are capable of damaging this environment, especially since it is generally, as far as we know, it's lifeless. And there's no, in most environments in space, there's no weather or water. And so anything we do to this environment isn't going to recover over time the way that a forest will recover after a fire. Any scars that we leave on the landscape, any major changes we do if we decide to pursue terraforming, it's going to make permanent changes. And so that means we need to think before we do this irreversible harm. We need to think about whether it's worth the changes that we're making. So a lot of times when we start talking about space as an environment or space ethics in general, one of the first questions that comes up is, okay, well, who's in charge of making these decisions? Who actually owns space? And this is actually a pretty well-studied question at this point. It's been studied by space lawyers, governments and regulators, and certainly by private companies who want to know that if they go into space to mine the moon, for example, that the costs they're putting in, that they'll be able to get that investment back by being allowed to sell the resources they extract or sell tickets to a space hotel that they're building. And so everyone wants to know, what does that mean? Who actually owns space? We do have some international law that addresses this. The big international treaty is the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which was written in the Cold War. And in fact, it's kind of amazing that it got signed at all, if you look at the treaty itself, during the height of the Cold War. One of the things that it's really clear about is that nations can't appropriate territory in space. But it's not as clear about private companies and individuals. Other treaties have tried to address this, but those treaties haven't really been successful. And of course, in the Cold War, they weren't thinking about private space companies. They were trying to prevent another land grab by nations. And so there's still a lot of debate about what that means. Various nations are trying to, including the US, are trying to argue that private companies, maybe they can't appropriate territory either, but they can extract resources and own those resources. And that sort of thing is, again, an urgent concern for the space industry, who want to make sure that the efforts and costs that they're putting into their work, that they're going to get back out. And this leads to the more general question of how will we share a space environment with each other? A lot of people think of space as being infinite, and certainly these companies that are trying to find investors like to talk about space being full of these infinite resources. And certainly space is very big, possibly infinite, but what's not infinite is the amount of resources we can reach. The resources that we want to use in space tend to be very concentrated in certain areas. So water ice in certain spots and craters in the moon, water in the poles on the polar ice caps of Mars, places that you want to put your landing pads or your solar panels on a planet, very limited. And so we might end up in situations where two different groups of people want to use the same piece of land in space. And that leads to questions like, what does property really mean in space? If we agree that no one can own a piece of land, that just means you can't plant a flag, put a fence around it and say no one can come in. But we still have to figure out, what if two people want to use the same piece of land? What are we going to have use rights, and how are we going to handle interference, harmful interference, as the Outer Space Treaty says, if two groups' activities interfere with each other on the same spot? And if that happens, how are we going to resolve conflicts over land use? The Outer Space Treaty talks kind of vaguely about consultation if there's going to be harmful interference, but that hasn't really been tested that strongly yet, and it will be eventually as we start to move out there. And as I mentioned, setting aside the question of the land ownership itself, who owns the resources that you extract from the space environment? If you brought the mining equipment there and you extract something valuable, do you get to keep it? Do you have to share it? How does that work? And on an ethical side of things, we need to think about things like environmental justice. So this is the idea that the costs and benefits of humans using an environment should be equitably distributed. We talk about this a lot on Earth right now with things like climate change, where poorer nations in the world, in particular, like island nations, are feeling the worst effects and the earliest effects of climate change, even though they've contributed the least to climate change, to fossil fuel use, which means they have benefited the least from using those fossil fuels, and yet they're paying most of the costs right now. So we want to avoid this situation in space and try to make sure that the costs and benefits are distributed more equally. But so far, the model that we're using in space as we talk about space resources and space mining in the future is sort of a lightly regulated capitalism. Like a company decides to pay the costs to get up there, they get investments, they build the equipment, they send their rockets up there, they extract the resources, they want to be able to benefit from those resources to balance out their cost, and they want to be able to sell those resources. The Outer Space Treaty, this is actually Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty. It's a very readable treaty, I have to say, if you want to go look it up. So Article 1, right at the beginning, says that activities in space should be carried out for the benefit and in the interest of all countries, irrespective of how economically or scientifically developed they are. In particular, this means that spacefaring nations should also be able to benefit from the use of space, even though they're not actually off spacefaring yet. And so this leads to an interesting challenge to the idea of just using a lightly regulated capitalist model, because you have to ask whether nations and companies in those nations that aren't spacefaring now, but maybe in a few decades, they manage to develop the ability to send people into space. By the time they get up there, will these finite resources have been used up? And in that way, is it unfair? Does it go against the idea that space should benefit all nations, irrespective of where they are right now? Another thing we have to think about with these finite resources is what we owe future generations. So this side of environmental justice is known as intergenerational justice. What obligations do we have towards humans living in the future? And of course, there's a lot of examples of intergenerational justice on Earth that we can learn from. Things like conserving finite resources on Earth. People talk about minerals and oil, for example. Preserving pristine wildernesses for future generations to enjoy, developing infrastructure for future generations. So we can learn a lot from intergenerational justice movements and researchers on Earth to think about good models for the future in space. It's also important to think about whether we need to protect the space environment for its own sake. Does it have its own intrinsic value? This is especially challenging because there's no life there. So again, without cute pandas or polar bears or even beautiful forests and rainforests, it's hard for humans to get their head around the idea that there's something worthy of protection here, if there's no life that's supported by this environment. On the other hand, you can look at it as this pristine wilderness, and we really do care about protecting wildernesses here on Earth. And I'm not sure that that's just because those wildernesses harbor life, because there are abiotic, so non-living parts of the Earth environment, like mountains and rivers, for example, that humans really value. And we can actually learn from the way that humans interact with those environments here on Earth to think about what we should be doing in space. In particular, I'm really fascinated by different societies in the world and different governments have started playing with the idea of granting legal personhood for different parts of their environment on Earth. So my example here, this is the Wanganui River, which is in New Zealand. And thanks to a lot of effort by the Maori community in New Zealand, they passed a law in 2017 that granted legal personhood to this river, the Wanganui River, which means that if there's, for example, a court case about development or pollution, something that's going to affect the river, they appoint a human representative to speak for the river on behalf of the river because it has rights as a legally living entity. There's a few other places around the world that have done this with rivers and with mountains. And just a couple years ago in 2021, a few lawyers and space researchers got together and wrote what they called the Declaration on the Rights of the Moon, that is similarly trying to argue that the moon itself should have legal personhood and should have a representative speaking for the moon itself when we talk about mining, for example, on the moon. And you can go look up that declaration and even add your signature, I think, still at this point. So that's all talking about if space is a lifeless environment, but what if space isn't lifeless? We don't know yet. There are certainly places in the solar system that we're still not sure whether there might be some microbial life or maybe even larger life in certain places. So right now there's a set of policies, guidelines in particular, that are for planetary protection. So planetary protection is the idea of preventing forward contamination, accidentally taking Earth life, especially microbial life, and contaminating a space environment. You bring that Earth life there and it starts to grow because there's some water and some warmth. It could spread and contaminate that environment. Back contamination is the idea that we want to prevent bringing space life back to Earth. That hasn't been an issue. We're less worried about that now than we were a few decades ago, because now we understand how inhospitable most of the solar system is. But it's still something that we think about. And as I said, there are guidelines talking about how to sterilize your spacecraft, for example, depending on where in the solar system you're going, to try to prevent this contamination. And for the most part, the history of planetary protection is about preserving the scientific integrity of this environment. So it's mostly been pushed forward by scientists, astrobiologists. What they're afraid of is that they'll get up to Mars, for example, find some microbial life, get really excited, and then not be able to tell whether it's real alien life that evolved in space or whether it's just some microbes we brought from Earth that have been spreading for a while. And so for the most part, this has been a focus of protecting that scientific integrity. And this is starting to get a little difficult because now we have more and more people going to space who aren't going for scientific research reasons. They're going for other reasons, and they are less interested in spending the time, the effort, and the cost to go through following all these guidelines and sterilizing their equipment. And so I think as human activity increases in space, there's going to be a lot more conflict about whether we follow these planetary protection rules, which is going to be tough for the scientists. And then we should ask, well, what if we do find life, even if it's just microbial life on Mars or one of these moons where we think there's liquid water? Does that mean we should still put all this effort in to avoid contaminating that environment? And we have no idea right now if Earth microbes would be able to compete with space microbes and whether they'd interact or affect each other at all. But we do need to worry about the fact that multiple times on Earth, we've seen new groups of organisms and humans come into an environment and bring a lot of invasive species and wipe out the local life. So how much do we need to worry about that if we find life in space? This is kind of tough for humans to think about, again, because we tend not to rank microbes particularly high on our scale of life forms, certainly not as high as humans and other animals. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to clean our bathrooms. But if we found microbial life in space, that would be an interesting question. It would be special microbial life. That's certainly true. More unique, more scientifically interesting, maybe worth protecting for that reason. And also, it's worth asking if we find microbial life in space, that life will be native to that environment, and we will essentially be the invaders. And so is there an ethical problem with us coming in and wiping out local life just because we want the land? That's calls back to a terrible history on Earth. So people like Carl Sagan have suggested that if we do find microbial life, say on Mars, that we shouldn't interact with Mars at all at that point. We should leave Mars to the Martians. And that's still a hotly debated topic inside space settlement advocacy today. So, water break. Okay, so the next big set of questions I'm going to ask, moving on from how we interact with the space environment, is just asking how are we going to interact with each other, right? So as I mentioned before, humans, we're going to bring a lot of our own issues with us. And a lot of our issues as a species is about how we interact with each other, how we cause each other harm, and how we protect each other, how we balance those things. So one fascinating subject to me is criminal justice in space. So imagine we have a space settlement, people are living there on a permanent basis. How will we address interpersonal harm, say, between individuals in that settlement? You can imagine all the normal crimes that you would see on TV these days, so violence and theft, etc. And we should also ask, while we're thinking about this, is how you would address harm caused by an individual against the community, things like sabotage or the kinds of thefts that you do from public resources. So first of all, if someone gets accused of a kind of crime like that, some kind of deviant behavior, as criminologists would say, how would you start by even determining guilt and conducting a fair trial? This could be especially tricky if you have a really small community, a fairly new space settlement, because suppose that the accused person is the settlement's only life support engineer, or they're the child of the commander of the settlement. How do you guarantee that you have an impartial trial? And then an even more difficult question is, what happens after the trial? What happens after guilt has been established? What do you do with that person to protect the community and address the harm that's been done? I've been really surprised as I've been talking about these topics for the past few years and writing about these topics, how many people immediately respond to this question with the idea of throwing someone out of an airlock. So there's even a TV tropes page about it. There's so much science fiction in which people who have done wrong just get thrown out the airlock. It's very clean, apparently, very efficient, and it's a very common cliche. But I think that even people who are very pro-capital punishment would agree that this is not the correct approach for every possible crime in a society. We have to figure out some way to address harm without just killing everyone who breaks the rules. So if you ask most Americans who aren't obsessed with airlocks, and most Westerners in general, what we should do with lawbreakers in space, most of them just suggest that we have space prisons because that's how our system works here on Earth. But there are a lot of practical and ethical problems with building prisons in space, and I'm just going to go through them now. So practical problems, first of all, you need to build a prison, right? They don't come built in. That requires resources. It requires the labor to build it. It requires the actual physical room that you need to keep shielded from radiation and pressurized with air. This photo is of San Quentin State Prison, which is in the state of California. And the first cell block in this prison was built by incarcerated people who were living on the prison ship Waban just off the coast. So they quarried the stone, they built the prison, and then they got moved into the prison. So would that be something that we'd end up having to do in a space settlement, forcing the accused people themselves to build their own prison? And then once you have built your prison, you need to maintain it. So that requires labor. If you're going to have guards and attendants, you'll need to remove that labor from doing other useful things from the settlement. And of course, it requires resources. You have to feed the people that you've incarcerated. You have to give them air and heat. And of course, the people that you have imprisoned in your space prison, they've been removed from your labor pool. And in the early days of a space settlement, labor might be especially scarce. So that could be a problem for the settlement as a whole, unless you want to force them to keep working while they're serving out their punishment. And certainly some legal systems, including the one I live in today, still include forced labor for inmates. But that tends to lead to a lot of exploitation and ethical problems. So speaking of ethical problems, this picture is a published design of a space prison by an astrophysicist named Charles Cockle. He calls it ExoConFac, which is the extraterrestrial containment facility. It looks a bit like a panopticon. And he was trying to design a humane prison that looks honestly very much like Earth-based prisons. But no matter how you design a prison, they are intrinsically designed in ways that are considered problematic by criminologists and activists and psychologists. So for one thing, they tend to be very violent spaces where just by definition, your ties to the community are severed, which makes it very difficult to reintegrate into the community in a healthy way afterwards. They really often tend to amplify existing inequalities in a society. And in space habitats in particular, a lot of psychologists are already studying the fact that we expect long-term space travel and living in space to really strain people's mental health because of the isolation, the confinement, the darkness, the fact that you're not going to be surrounded by nature, all these things that we know is unhealthy for humans. And so if you deliberately design these space prisons within a space habitat that are intended to be isolating and confining, it's probably only going to exacerbate people's mental health problems. So if we're worried about all these different issues with space prisons, what are the alternatives? We still have to address the issues of criminal behavior. But it turns out there are a lot of alternatives that people have used here on Earth. Prisons are actually a relatively recent invention on Earth. Plenty of communities of humans throughout history and today use systems that don't involve prisons at all. but still address harmful behavior of members of their community. And I always like to point out that as of today, there are no prisons in space. So if we one day have space prisons, it will be because we decided to build them, which means that we have the choice and the opportunity right now to decide not to build them and take the time that we have now to consider whether there's better alternatives. So one example that a lot of activists in the States, at least, are working towards is called restorative justice, which are problems that address bringing closure and a feeling of safety to the victims of a crime, improving the safety of the community as a whole, and addressing the causes of crime and criminal behavior at the individual level and in the society as a whole. So it's worth taking the time now to really look at all these alternatives, especially the ones that work well for small, isolated communities, and see whether there's any systems we want to put into place now, hopefully before a crime in space happens, that don't involve just building another prison in space. So we've talked about harm between individuals in a community and harm caused by an individual towards the community, but we also need to think about organizational harm. So when a community harms individuals within the community, in particular when the leadership harms the community. So for example, how do we protect workers in space from being exploited? How do we protect the population or a minority population in a space settlement from being oppressed by the leadership of the settlement? And this is actually going to be an extra challenge in space compared to Earth, because there's a lot of physical characteristics of space that will make feeling free to protest against injustice, that'll make that difficult. So for example, as you can see in this picture, space is very isolated, very remote. Travel in space is very difficult. And so if you feel that you're being oppressed, if your rights are being taken away, you can't just escape. You can't just walk out and go live off the land, because the land looks like this. And it's also going to be difficult to even just get to another habitat, depending on how close they are to each other. And so that's a limitation. There's also a concern that if life support is controlled in a central way, this depends on how you design it, and if the control of the life support is controlled by the leadership of the settlement, whether that's an employer or a government, then that makes it a lot riskier to protest against that government, because whoever controls the life support can shut down any activities that they don't like just by turning down the oxygen, which makes it very difficult to stage a protest or go on strike, for example. And there's actually quite a lot of parallels in human history, especially about labor rights and these kinds of environments. So I'll just do a quick few right here. This is the factory of the Pullman Palace Car Company. This was a rail car company. They made rail cars in the States, in the town of Pullman, Illinois, which was the sort of the prototypical company town. Company town is where the company employs everyone in the town, and everyone who lives and works in the town also pays rent to the company. They buy food from the company store. Everything is controlled by the company. And that tends to lead, again, to a lot of exploitation. In the Pullman Company in Pullman, Illinois, what happened is that the company reduced wages during some economic downturn in 1893, but they didn't reduce rents. So all of their employees were running out of money, unable to pay their rents. This led to a strike. This is a photo of the protest from the strike the next year. And you can easily imagine the same thing happening in a space settlement. If it's a mining company that built the space settlement itself, then is everyone who's working for the company and living there, are they also paying rent to the company? Are they buying food from the company? Are they buying air from the company? And what does that mean if the economy changes and if people start to go broke? What's going to happen? Another example that I like to bring up is from the transcontinental railroads that were built across North America. Very harsh working conditions, very isolated working conditions, building very important infrastructure for the US. And in particular, there are a lot of Chinese immigrant laborers who did a lot of hard work on the transcontinental railroad, but they were discriminated against. They weren't paid as well as their white counterparts. And at one point, a group of these Chinese workers went on strike at their work site in 1867. And within a few days, the railroad company, decided to just cut off their supply lines. So they were out in the mountains. They were no longer receiving any food or other supplies, and that really quickly broke the strike. So again, you can imagine the same situation in space, if a group of workers who are working out at a site in space, if they decide to go on strike, it would be very easy for whoever controls their food or their water or their air to quickly shut down that strike. And the last example I like to bring up is the fishing industry in Thailand today, because of course there are still labor rights abuses happening today. What happens out in Thailand is that poor migrant workers from Myanmar, they can't afford to travel to Thailand, so they go into debt to come to Thailand. Their debtors take their passports away, stick them on fishing boats, and send them off to sea, where they're then essentially trapped both physically and legally on the boats. And this can easily lead to a lot of abuse, physical abuse, exploitation. And I've talked to labor rights experts today who are working on the Thailand fishing industry problem, who say they can easily imagine the same thing happening in space. Nobody can pay their own way to space who's going to go out and work there. They go into debt in order to be taken out to Mars or to an asteroid mining facility. Then they're in debt to their employer. They have no way to get back on their own. They're isolated. Maybe no one's monitoring the work site. You can see how this could also lead to exploitation and abuse in certain situations. So there have been people asking, is there anything we can do to prevent these issues as we design space settlements? In particular, some people have suggested designing the ability to protest and the ability to leave and fight oppression, physically design it into the habitats. So, for example, make sure that the life support isn't centrally controlled. Make sure that it's distributed or it's modular in some way that the leadership can't just shut down a strike by turning off the air. Make sure that people have a right to travel, maybe a guaranteed right of return if they want to come back to Earth, or guarantee that everyone has access to spacesuits so they can get in a rover and go to another settlement if they want to escape. And of course, we can also design these kind of rights into the legal system and even into the culture of space settlements to make sure that we are really valuing liberty and the right to protest and the right to organize in the future. All right, and the last topic. Once we've figured out how to live with the environment, we figured out how to survive each other. How do we go beyond surviving and build places where we can thrive, where we can have healthy and rich lives as we live out our lives in space? So one important key to that is making sure that we have the ability to ensure that we have a healthy population. So we need to think about how to plan for medical emergencies in space. This is something people already work on today, of course, and it's a challenge because it's hard to plan for every possible emergency, and there's always a concern that you won't have the right medication, the right equipment, or the right expertise. So there's a lot of examples from certain environments in Earth too. Antarctica is a great example of places where this sort of thing has happened. This is a photo of a Soviet doctor named Rogozov, who was working, I think he was overwintering in Antarctica and developed appendicitis, and he was the only surgeon there. And so I've censored this for your sake, but this is an actual photograph of him performing an appendectomy on himself with the help of a couple of assistants with mirrors. And so these are the sorts of situations you get into if you don't have enough medical expertise, for example. And so these are things that space agencies and planners think about today. But long term, there's even more types of health issues we need to think about. If we have people living out their entire lives in space, we need to worry about more than just acute emergencies. We need to think about how to treat chronic conditions like diabetes or health or heart issues long term. We need to think about palliative care as people reach the end of their lives. How are we going to make sure that we've prepared for that in a space settlement? And of course, no matter how much planning we do, no matter what we bring along, we're not reproducing all of Earth's healthcare system in space. So inevitably something will happen where our resources are too scarce compared to the need from our patients. So we have to ask what to do. And generally what the medical community does is called triage, and figuring out how to distribute scarce resources to abundant patients in a way that saves as many lives as possible. And as I mentioned, we can learn a lot from austere wilderness rural areas on Earth. We can do things like cross-training to make sure you have more than one surgeon, more than one dentist, make sure you've You've packed your equipment and medication in a really efficient way. This picture is the kit used by Robert Falcon Scott in his 1910 Antarctic expeditions. This is the same kind of idea. Of course, we've got much better equipment these days, but you have to think about what you'll need most urgently, think about what can serve multiple purposes. And in space in particular, we're going to think about what can we produce locally? Can we grow antibiotics or insulin or something without having to bring it all from Earth? We can also think about how to prevent medical problems so we avoid having to face these issues. In particular, what's really common in space agencies today is health screenings. They very, very strict health and physical fitness screenings if you want to be an astronaut. And that's mostly because they don't want to send people into space who are at higher risk of having a health emergency or who need maintenance of some kind of chronic condition. And this means that the astronauts and the space travelers so far have been extremely able-bodied, and a lot of disabled people and chronically ill people have been ruled out. But in the long term, if we're talking about sending people to space for the rest of their lives, then we need to maybe reframe that question and realize that when we're talking about the rest of our lives, all of us will become ill and or disabled or face some kind of medical emergency at some point. And in fact, as has been pointed out by a lot of disability rights advocates, space is disabling for everyone. None of us were intended to live. We weren't evolved to live in these kinds of environments. And so it makes more sense to try to design our space technology, our space habitats to be as accessible as possible to make sure that we can treat chronic conditions that might develop even in healthy people later down the line. And once we do that, we can really open up the pool of space travelers to include all of these excellent candidates who might be ruled out by a health screening today. And of course, besides learning from wilderness medicine, we can also learn from pandemics on Earth. The emergency triage that I mentioned before that happens in an ER or an A&E for you folks, or the scene of a natural disaster or scene of mass violence, that kind of practice is very well established and well practiced. It comes from battlefield medicine in particular. But we also need to worry in space about a longer, slower disaster like a pandemic or a radiation leak where you don't have enough radiation treatments for all the patients who have been exposed, for example. And of course, we all have learned a lot about this in the last few years. Different cities and hospitals ran out of ventilators during the pandemic. We've run out of, or in the early days of vaccines, we didn't have enough vaccines to go around. And we had to think about how to distribute those resources in the best way. And answering these questions and defining what the best way means really reveals what a society values. And there's a lot of research that goes into this in public consultation, even before the COVID pandemic. There's always been a lot of discussion about, well, who do we want to prioritize in a pandemic or some other disaster where we don't have enough equipment to save everybody? Do we want to prioritize younger people? Do we want to prioritize people who are more likely to survive? Do we want to prioritize the doctors and nurses and healthcare workers? And in space, that would be maybe you want to prioritize saving the engineers who can keep the ship or the settlement running. And so these are really questions you need to work out ahead of time, like most triage protocols are developed ahead of time, because in the moment, it's really easy for emotions to take over. So aside from medical emergencies and general medical concerns, we also need to think about what to do with future generations. If we want to have permanent, self-sustaining human populations in space, then we have to be able to reproduce in space. We have to be able to replenish the population in ways besides just bringing more people from Earth. And so we need to think about what obligations we have towards this future generation. We need to think about intergenerational justice. And also, it's a challenge. Anyone who has kids knows this. We can't ask these future generations what they want. They can't consent to the decisions that we make. And so we have to try to decide for them, which is a big responsibility. And one of the first difficulties with this is that we don't actually even know if it's possible for humans to reproduce in space or safely grow fetuses and develop healthy children. There have been some animal studies done in space on different parts of the conception and development process. So far, the evidence has not been extremely conclusive either way, but there hasn't been human testing because of the other challenge here, which is that we don't even know how to study this in an ethical way. Most medical researchers, bioethicists, they really frown on doing experimentation on pregnant people and their fetuses for obvious reasons. This has led to some difficulties here on Earth. For example, pregnant patients often are not included in drug trials, which means that then those patients don't know if they can take certain drugs. So this is already a bioethics challenge on Earth, and trying to figure out whether humans can safely conceive and grow children in space is going to be difficult. And whoever the first people are who take those steps are going to be taking an enormous risk. But say we figure out how to have healthy reproduction in space, then we still need to figure out how to balance that reproduction with the needs of the society. So, for example, if we're in a space settlement where resources are very scarce, so our potato farm on Mars can only grow so many calories and feed so many people, what happens if people have too many babies? How do we control that? And of course, human history is full of examples of the harms that can be caused when governments try to limit the population. We've seen things like forced sterilization, forced abortion, denial of support and assistance to families that have too many children, which then inevitably harms the children. And often what we've seen historically on Earth is that this kind of attempt to control fertility is usually focused on certain groups and not others, which tends to lead to a slippery slope towards eugenics. All of which, again, we could see again in space in the name of protecting the survival of the community if we're not careful and think about what the ethical thing is to do ahead of time. And of course, space settlements might also face the opposite problem. If instead of resources being scarce, the humans themselves are scarce, labor is scarce, then they might worry about underpopulation, especially if they have a sort of unbalanced society where they have a lot of older people who can't work and not enough younger people. And while this isn't as talked about here on Earth, we have also seen examples, cautionary tales from history here on Earth as well, with underpopulation, in particular in Europe. And after World War I, so much of the population was wiped out that certain countries like France and Russia did things like outlawing abortion and contraception, and even things like birth control education, which really takes away the rights of a person to control their own reproduction, control their own bodily autonomy. And really, all of these questions are about this central question of how do you balance the needs of the community with an individual's rights to control their own body? And so this is a question we're going to have to keep asking. We also need to think about the rights of those children once they're born and as they're growing in space. It's very possible, we don't know for sure, but it's possible that children that are born and grow up in space in a different gravity environment, for example, just won't be able to return to Earth. Again, we haven't tried this with children, but we know with adults, adult astronauts who spend months in space are often unable to walk when they return to Earth. After they land, they have to be carried. It takes a while for their heart to get strong enough to keep their blood pressure up and their muscles to get strong enough to walk around. It's possible if you grow up in space, your muscles, your bones, your heart won't develop enough to let you come back and walk around on Earth. Which leads to an interesting ethical question. Is that ethical? Are we stealing something from them, some kind of birthright, by taking away their ability to return to the planet where their ancestors evolved? And we can look again to Earth and to parallels here on Earth. There are refugee families who have to make a similar decision on Earth today of whether to take their children on an extremely dangerous journey and take them to a new place where potentially they will never be able to return to their homeland. Parents have been having to make these kinds of decisions for their children throughout human history. So now that I've gone through all of these examples, you might be asking, okay, well, what do we do about all of these things? I have a few suggestions right here at the end of the talk. One, of course, as I've been demonstrating, is that you should learn from experts. We should be inviting social scientists into all of our planning and talking about space settlement. So this includes philosophers and ethicists, of course, and also historians, especially colonial historians, people who can tell us how humans have lived together in the past. And of course, that also includes anthropologists, sociologists, and lawyers and political scientists who can tell us how to turn ethical conversations into actual policy. There's so much we can learn from history. There's, of course, all the cautionary tales about how oppression and exploitation arise throughout history, how, in particular, the history of colonization across the Earth has caused genocides, both intentional and unintentional, catastrophic environmental damage, like on the island of Rapa Nui or Easter Island, as shown here, and lasting inequality that still exists today. So we really need to study this history, especially as people talk about space colonization. We need to think about whether that's the model we want to bring forward into the future in space. Of course, there's also success stories we can learn from history, how we've learned to live within the limits of our environment, how we've overcome periods of oppression and of disaster, how we've built systems that protect people and perpetuate our values. And along those lines, we can also learn from activists who are working today on a variety of different topics, of course, but most activists are able to dream of a better world, not just complain about something specific, but think of a better future and develop concrete plans on how they think we should reach that future. And that's a really valuable skill. They also have a lot of practical skills like raising public awareness, lobbying for policy change, and pacing themselves to work on a goal that they might not see in their lifetimes, which is also important for space settlement. And of course, we should learn from marginalized communities. Most of the loud public conversations happening about space settlement are happening in white, Western, and developed countries. But most people would agree that our future in space belongs to everyone. I like to read a lot of work in African futurism, indigenous futurism. The image I'm showing here is a piece of art by an Afrofuturist artist named Jackie and Jerry, who has a series called Masai that I highly recommend. There's so much we can learn from these communities, especially non-Western philosophies and worldviews, and especially with regards to the environment and how to live sustainably with an environment, but really on all of these topics. And finally, my last slide is we should just keep having these conversations. I appreciate all of you come to this talk. I hope you continue to have conversations about these topics after the talk. I love people who love space. I love that we like to imagine our future in space. We're also problem solvers, and I just want people to harness that enthusiasm and those problem solving skills to work on these human problems as well, and to develop a vision for the kind of world we want our descendants to have, both in space and on Earth. And I will stop there, and I'm looking forward to our Q&A session.